Okay, the last part of this unit is in chapter 18, and probably many of you have already had a nutrition class. Raise your hand if you've had nutrition. Okay, y'all, the two of you, usually it's more than that, but you'll all be taking it, I imagine. You're going to cover this in a whole lot more depth in that class, and I really don't do it justice. I'm not going to go into as much information as your notes or as your book says. So you're thankful? Yeah, nutrition's actually a very difficult course. There's a lot of chemistry involved in nutrition. But when we talk about nutrition, it's the perfect ending for the digestive system because this is what's being absorbed. So in this chapter, we're going to learn what nutrients are. Some of them are uh, you need in larger amounts than others. The macronutrients are what we usually think of as our food groups: carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So we'll break those down a little bit today. A lot of it you've already learned. So some of this is a review. And then the micronutrients are vitamins and minerals. Okay, but as we go through this chapter, you're going to hear me use this term, essential nutrients. And what that means is you must have those in the foods that you eat because even though, let's say, an essential nutrient, let's say it's made up of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, you already have a lot of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in you, and you can make some nutrients because you have the enzymes to make them. But other ones, you lack enzymes to make them, and that means you have to get them already made in the food that you eat. And so those kinds of nutrients are what we call essential. They must be in the food that you eat. Okay. So let's start with the macronutrients and the carbohydrates. You know the categories of carbohydrates. You've learned these before. The monosaccharides, disaccharides. So monosaccharides are simple sugars. Disaccharides are double sugars. And then polysaccharides are long chains of simple sugars, the complex carbohydrates. As far as your food carbohydrates are concerned, the monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, galactose. And most of our foods don't have just the pure monosaccharides in them. Usually the glucose, fructose, and galactose are components of di or polysaccharides in the foods that we eat. Okay. The disaccharides in our foods are sucrose, like table sugar, cane sugar is sucrose. Maltose is made up of two glucose units, and it's found in malts and grains. Lactose is a glucose and a galactose, and it's found in dairy products, the sugar in dairy products. Okay, and then the food polysaccharides are mostly starches. Okay, the plant starches. Okay, some of the reasons you need carbohydrates in your diet. Um, you that's the big thing that's broken down through cell respiration. But even with this, carbohydrates are not considered essential. You got to have them in you, but you can make carbohydrates from a lot of other things. You have the enzymes to put the atoms together. Um, you use them in cell respiration constantly. Um, Glycogen, if you have a little excess, the glucose can be joined together in your liver and in your skeletal muscle to form a polysaccharide called glycogen, and that's our short-term energy storage molecule. Um, and then without the carbohydrates in you, DNA and RNA contain ribose and deoxyribose. Those are major carbohydrates, aren't they? They're monosaccharides. Any excess can easily be converted to fat. If you have an excess of any of the organic compounds, they can be converted to fat. Fat's kind of like your starvation molecule. All right, and then nursing women need, of course, adequate carbohydrates to produce enough lactose for milk. And then DMR, that stands for daily minimal requirement. Most of us eat a lot more than is necessary. If you were to look on a cracker box or food, any of the prepared food boxes or bags, if you look at the food label, you'll probably see a good bit of carbohydrates there. You know, our diets are loaded with carbohydrates. But this is interesting. Here's your famous monosaccharides: glucose, fructose, galactose. And you don't have to know this for the test, but their molecular formula, regardless of which one it is C6H12O6. We always think of that as glucose, but so is fructose and so is galactose. If you counted up the hydrogens, carbons, and oxygens, you'd see that. But the way they're arranged is a little different. So their structural formulas are different from each other. So you have the enzymes to interconvert those very easily. I like this flow chart. This is how carbohydrates are utilized in you. When you eat carbohydrates, basically you're eating starches and you're eating disaccharides. Okay? And then when they are broken down in your digestive tract, they're broken down into the individual simple sugars that then move to your cells, and then from there, as they move into your cells, one of three things happens. They can immediately be broken down through cell respiration, or they can be joined with other glucoses to form glycogen, and then once you've filled up your glycogen reserves, you form fat. Okay, you don't have to know this specifically for the test, but that's interesting how it can be used. So all these monosaccharides can be converted into glucose that can then be stored as glycogen, or they can be converted to fats. Okay. All right, so that's your carbohydrates. For your lipids, your food lipids tend to be the triglycerides, the fats, and then cholesterol. But phospholipids are other lipids that are very important in us, and we're getting those in foods we eat if you're eating cells, which you do. Eat a lot of cells, don't you? But your triglycerides, you remember, those are the animal fats, vegetable oils, and each molecule is made up of 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. Okay, and then cholesterol. Without cholesterol, we can't produce steroid hormones. Our cell membranes are not stable. Remember, cholesterol is a component of the cell membranes. This is interesting. Your liver can make all the cholesterol you need. That's one of its functions. It can remove cholesterol from the blood, but it can also produce cholesterol. Some people's livers make too much of it or don't remove enough from the blood. It can cause problems. But you could live with a no cholesterol diet. Okay. Typically, if you eat nothing but plant foods, you're totally vegan, you don't even have dairy products, all right, you probably are not getting any cholesterol in your diet, but you can live very easily with that because your liver can make all the cholesterol you need. Cholesterol tends to come from animal products, okay, because it's a component of animal cell membranes. If you have any excess cholesterol, we learned in the last chapter that any excess can be excreted in bile. It is a component of bile. In fact, sometimes gallstones are loaded with cholesterol. The other component is usually calcium, comes out of solution. But, okay. All right, now, as far as how the lipids are used in the body, you know how, especially triglyceride, is made up of a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Okay, so it's broken down into those individual fatty acids that are then absorbed. Okay, there are some fatty acids that we have to have in order to make some of our cells phospholipids, and we have to have those fatty acids already in their full-fledged form in the triglycerides you eat, because you can't make them from carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. We lack the enzymes for that. And those are some essential fatty acids. Linoleic acid is one of those. And they're found in some of the phospholipids that we need to make when we make cells. All right, and so because there are some fatty acids that are essential, that means you cannot survive without you can't survive with a no fat diet. You have to have triglycerides in your diet. You don't need a lot, but you have to have some because they're providing some of these essential fatty acids. Okay. All right. Um, Many of us get way too much fat in our diet, but here's the recommendation: is not more than 30% of the calories daily come from fat. You might want to look at food labels and be shocked. But um, now this is important to me. Okay. In your blood and any other body fluid, you know that these triglycerides cannot dissolve in the watery environment. Okay, and so they have to combine with proteins, and the combination can be dissolved. That kind of new structure is called a lipoprotein. And you have a lot of lipoproteins in various places of the body. We talked about one just very recently in the last chapter. Remember when I talked about a chylomicron? A chylomicron was when the fats from the foods you eat before they get into the lacteal, they're combined with some proteins. Okay, and those fats are mostly triglycerides. They're mostly triglycerides. Okay, that's an example of one of these lipoproteins. That's the digestive one. All right, but in your bloodstream, you have a variety of lipoproteins, and here they are. Okay, VLDL, that stands for very low density lipoprotein. And then LDL stands for low density lipoprotein, and HDL stands for high density lipoprotein. And so what that has to do with on these densities, if you think about a lipoprotein being lipids and proteins, okay, they have different densities. Okay, and listen to me carefully. Let's say if you were holding your hand, in your hand you had a cubic foot of the leanest steak possible, a whole cubic foot of it. That's loaded with protein in it. And then in the other hand you held a cubic foot of chicken fat, which is all triglycerides. Okay? So the dimensions are the same, a cubic foot. Which one do you think would be more dense or heavier? The steak is heavier than fat, isn't it? Think about a piece of steak that has fat on it. The steak part of it is much heavier than the fat part, right? Protein is more dense than lipids are. Okay? So a lipoprotein with the highest protein content would be more dense than a lipoprotein with a lower protein content. Does that make sense? Okay. The percentage of the various components of a lipoprotein give it these categories: very low density, or high density. So if I was going to draw a lipoprotein, in the middle of it is the part that is totally water insoluble, which would be the triglycerides, like animal fats, vegetable oils, the triglyceride. Totally water insoluble. But surrounding that would be a protein component, because part of that can dissolve in water, so it's on the outside. And then there's going to be a cholesterol component. And then there's also a phospholipid. I'll put PL for phospholipid component. All right. When you form chylomicrons at your digestive tract, they are loaded with triglycerides. So imagine the middle part being huge, triglyceride. And then there's the protein and the others: cholesterol, protein, and phospholipid. Okay. All right. So because of that, because the triglycerides in the middle, there's a big abundance of that. That would be an example, sort of a very low density lipoprotein. So chylomicrons, in a way, are like these, very low density. So they have a very high triglyceride content. But as they move through your bloodstream, they're going to make their way to your liver. And your liver and other cells can pull out the triglyceride part of it. So imagine the middle of this shrinking. And so now it looks more like this one. So now do you see how the cholesterol forms a bigger percentage of the whole thing? It's still got a good bit of triglyceride, but it still has a bunch of this lipid cholesterol. And that's what we call a low density lipoprotein. That's the one that has the highest cholesterol content. Okay, a low density lipoprotein. That's the one that is bad for your health. This is the bad one, okay, the low-density lipoprotein. The reason it's bad is because it has such a high concentration of cholesterol, that cholesterol can drop off and cause problems in your cardiovascular system, cause the buildup in the wall of your blood vessels, that cholesterol buildup. Okay, but thank goodness you do have a wonderful organ like a liver, and a liver can remove a lot of that cholesterol. So if you get rid of the cholesterol part, and you've already gotten rid of a lot of the triglyceride part, do you see how the protein becomes a bigger percentage of it? And that's the high-density lipoprotein, and that's the best one. That's the good one. So when you have a lipid panel done as a blood test, they do your total cholesterol, but then they break it down into your good cholesterol and your bad cholesterol. Your good cholesterol, that's the HDLs. You want high HDL levels, and you want low LDL. That's the bad cholesterol, LDL levels. The reason HDLs are good for you is because, obviously, they don't have much cholesterol, but because they don't have much, they can literally clean up the cholesterol that's laid out in your blood vessels. So they can take up and remove cholesterol from your blood. So, all right. So here's how your body utilizes triglycerides. They're broken down into fatty acids and glycerol, and then from there, as they get to your cells, the triglycerides can interconvert, or the fatty acids can interconvert with other glycerol to form the triglycerides of you, like in your adipose tissue. Or it can form various lipoproteins, like surfactant is a type of lipoprotein. They can interconvert to other fatty acids that you might need for various things, except for the essential ones. So you got to have some already formed in your diet. They can be converted to cholesterol. It can be converted to phospholipids. Okay, so that's how your body utilizes all these triglycerides. So we've done carbohydrates and lipids. Now let's look at proteins. You know proteins are made up of amino acids, and I think I've mentioned to you in the past that on this earth there are 20 different kinds of amino acids. Okay, doesn't matter what organism you are, you have pretty much the same 20 kinds of amino acids. The way they're combined in a protein determines what protein it is. Okay, and we need proteins. They provide so much for us. Every enzyme that exists is a protein molecule. Many proteins provide structure, like all those microtubules and microfilaments and centrioles. They're all proteins. Proteins are components of our cell membranes. Okay, transporting, like for HDLs, LDLs, there's protein components in that. Yes, proteins are needed for so many different things. If you look at this table, these are all the 20 amino acids. And do you see how 8 of them have a little E beside of them? And that means you can't make these. You can't interconvert enough to make these. So that means they have to be in the proteins that you eat. Okay? Those are the essential amino acids. Okay? Like for asparagine on this one, you wouldn't have to get that already formed in the foods you eat because you can interconvert other amino acids into it. You can make it. But you can't make like leucine and isoleucine. In a child, arginine and histidine are considered essential amino acids. But as an adult, it's the other 8. You don't have to memorize any of these. You just need to know that as an adult, 8 amino acids are essential. So that means you have to get them in the foods that you eat. And the only place you get amino acids is in proteins. So you can't live with a no protein diet. You have to have protein in your diet. But some food proteins are considered complete proteins. Some food proteins are considered incomplete proteins. The difference in the two is that in a complete protein molecule, you've got enough of all 8 essential amino acids in that one protein molecule. In an incomplete protein, you don't have all of the 8. You may have some of them, but you don't have all of them. Complete proteins tend to be found in the animal kingdom. So if you eat any kind of food that comes from an animal, whether it be meat, fish, poultry, milk, eggs, cheese, you're getting complete proteins in your diet. if you are a complete vegan, meaning you don't have any animal products in your diet, you can be very healthy. In fact, you probably are very healthy because you're getting a much lower fat diet and lower cholesterol. But um, but you have to get the right combination of plant proteins. All 20 amino acids are found in the plant kingdom. They're just not all within each protein molecule. Okay? Whereas in the animal kingdom, they're all in all the proteins, pretty much. Okay? Um, so you got to have the right combination. Like red beans and rice, I've mentioned here. That's a staple in the diet in a lot of the world. I take students to Costa Rica every year, and we get really up close and personal with red beans and rice. Or not red beans, beans and rice. It's cheap, it's easy to come by, it's easy to fix, and it's very nutritious because it's the right combination of plant proteins. So the combination makes it complete. Okay. Okay, here's how your body utilizes proteins. When you break them down in your digestive tract, they're broken down into amino acids, and that's the form they're in when they're absorbed. And so when they get into your cells, a lot of things can happen. Those amino acids can recombine to form the various proteins you need. Or, over here on the right, an amino acid can be converted to glucose to be broken down, or basically, not really converted to glucose, but it can go through the Krebs cycle and be broken down through respiration. Or it can be converted to glucose. Or any excess can be converted to fat. So everything can be converted to fat. All right, and then this is showing you a little bit more depth, not test information, but I need you to watch this. This shows you a little more depth in how your body processes amino acids. If you are going to break down the amino acids and not store them in other forms, if you're going to break them down to get energy, you remember an amino acid has this thing called an amine group. The NH2 is an amine group, and then on one end, and then it has the C double bond O OH. That's called a carboxyl group on the other end. And then in the middle, you have a carbon with a hydrogen, and then something else is attached to that carbon. Whatever's attached there determines what amino acid it is. All right, well, the first thing that happens when your cells break down amino acids is that they take off the amine group. That is called deamination. So here's the amine group, see? And that becomes one of your nitrogenous waste products. Basically, two of those join together to form urea. And that's the waste product of protein breakdown. You get rid of this part, and then you save the rest of this. The rest of this can be utilized to make carbohydrates or fats. Don't both of those have carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, which is in the rest of this? Or do you see how there's two carbons there? That can go into the Krebs cycle and go through cell respiration. Okay. But look at what's removed, the NH2 group. That's a nitrogenous substance, and that affects a body condition called your nitrogen balance. Nitrogen balance is an indication of protein intake and output by a person. And people who are starving because they're not getting enough protein in their diet, they're going to have what's called a negative nitrogen balance. They're losing all this nitrogen, but they're not replacing it by more protein that they're eating. Okay? That's what happens during starvation. All right, if you have a positive nitrogen balance, that's when you're taking in more protein than you're breaking down, and you can see examples of that. I have talked about a negative nitrogen balance. I guess I don't have it here. I thought I've got it in your notes. Let me look right here. Yeah, right here. If you have a deficiency of protein, I've talked about that. If you have a negative nitrogen balance, your body's going to try to compensate by breaking down the proteins that are in your blood plasma like the albumins, which makes your blood lose osmotic pressure. I've talked about that. And then that results in the swelling of your tissues, and that's that type of nutritional edema. So if somebody has a protein deficiency, they may struggle with nutritional edema. There are other kinds of edema, but this is the one due to a lack of protein, a negative nitrogen balance. Okay. Okay. All right. Now we're going to look at energy a little bit in the body. You all hear when we eat food, we talk about how many calories we eat. Technically, all a calorie is a unit of heat. It's a way to measure energy or heat production. Heat's a type of energy, isn't it? But technically, if you were in a physics class or chemistry class or physical science and you were studying calories, you would learn that a calorie is the amount of heat required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So not very much, just a little bit of heat. All right, a food calorie is 1,000 times that amount. Technically, a food calorie is a kilocalorie, and it should have a capital C. But on your food labels at home, on your food boxes and cans, they don't use a capital C. They should, because it's. But anyway, that's 1,000 times that amount. All right. So if you broke down a complete gram of carbohydrates completely, that would generate about 4 food calories. If you broke down a gram of protein, about the same thing. But if you broke down a gram of fat, you get more calories from breakdown of fat. It's over twice, isn't it? You don't have to know those numbers specifically. Just know that you get a lot more calories from the breakdown of the same amount of fat as you do protein or carbohydrate, which you probably already know. Okay. And then some terms you hear sometimes, your basal metabolic rate, that's how fast your body expends energy when you're in what's called a basal state. When you first wake up in the morning after you've had a long sleep and you're rested, you are in what's called the basal state. So overnight fasting, that just means you've been asleep and you hadn't been eating. So 8 hours sleep. All right. So everybody's basal metabolic rate is pretty much genetically controlled by how much thyroxine you produce. All right, but that by itself is a big indication of how many calories are required by you every day. But that's not the only thing. It's not the only thing that is used to calculate your caloric requirements. It's your BMR, it's your body temperature, the degree of muscle activity, meaning your exercise, your activity level, and then how old you are, your rate of growth affects it. When you're a child, some of you were getting to this age, when you were a child, you could eat more without gaining weight than you can now. And it's because you were growing. Right? As you get older, you tend to decrease your muscle activity, so you can't eat as much either. But anyway, but your BMR and all those other things determine how many calories you should have every day to maintain your weight. Okay. All right, so as we talk about weight, this is not always a very comfortable subject, but basically you need to take in the number of calories that you expend every day and not any more than that if you don't want to gain or lose weight. All right. BMR, your basal metabolic rate, is different from the BMI. BMI is what you hear of more. It's called the body mass index, and that's what exercise physiologists and nutritionists use to calculate if your body's in a desirable weight or not. And if a person is overweight, usually this is based on your height versus your weight, and if you're male or female. But obviously, there's a lot of other things that go into your weight. There are people who exercise all the time and they've built so much muscle mass. Muscle mass is dense, and on the scale compared to their height, it may be overweight, but they're not obese because they don't have a high fat content. But anyway, basically, overweight is if you exceed your body mass index or your desirable weight by 10 to 20%. Or, in other words, you have a body mass index between 25 and 30. So let's look at that on this table. Let's say if you're 5'8" and your weight is 160 and you're 5'8", right there, you're in a healthy weight. But a little bit over that, if you're 170, you're not. You're considered overweight. But if it's over 30%, then that's considered obese. This is a little eye-opening. Okay. More and more people are falling into these categories, especially in the United States. We have easy food available all the time, and easy food is loaded with carbohydrates and fat. Okay. All right. So, we've looked at carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and now we're going to look at the micronutrients, the vitamins and the minerals. All right. The difference in a vitamin and a mineral is that a vitamin is an organic molecule. It's just not a carbohydrate, lipid, or protein. And a mineral, those are just the ions, calcium, potassium, individual elements. Okay. All vitamins are organic, and all vitamins are essential. Even though we can make some, like vitamin K in your digestive tract, it's not enough. So you have to get vitamins in the foods that you eat. And vitamins can be classified into two categories based on their solubility in water. Those that don't dissolve in water, vitamins A, D, E, and K, those are considered the lipid or fat-soluble vitamins. Does it make sense that you absorb them more easily if bile salts are present? Don't bile salts emulsify fats? So it breaks it down so that they can be pulled out more easily? Okay. All right. I have put just a little bit of information about each one of these. When you take a nutrition class, you'll learn what kind of foods they're in, what happens to you if you have too much of them, what happens to you if you don't have enough of them. Right. Basically, for most of this, I've put some information that you either have already learned or we're going to learn it in the next unit. Vitamin D can be stored in the skin. It is structurally kind of like a steroid, but without vitamin D, you can't absorb calcium from the foods that you eat. We've already learned that, right? Okay, vitamin E. We hadn't learned anything about vitamin E, but it's interesting. A long time ago, it was considered the youth vitamin, mainly because it helped keep cell membranes stable. But today we know that it acts as an antioxidant, as does vitamin A. What that means, when you have just normal metabolic activities in your cells, you're producing a lot of waste products. One of those categories of waste products, you don't have to write any of this down, by the way. They're called free radicals. And free radicals can wrinkle your skin, but they can also cause cancer, can be devastating to your health. An antioxidant is a chemical that combines with free radicals, so they're not harmful. So that's why you see vitamin E and vitamin A in skincare products. And why it's good for your health is because it helps to take up, one reason, these free radicals throughout the body. Vitamin K, we talked about, it's necessary for blood clotting. And then vitamin A, way back when we did the rods and the cones, remember rhodopsin in the rods requires vitamin A, and it comes from carotenes. Carotenes are an orange plant pigment. Right. All right, so you need to memorize that these are the fat soluble, and memorize this little bit that I've typed, because it could be a lot worse. Here's your book's view of all of these four. Okay? All right. The water soluble vitamins, look at them. Whew, there's a bunch of those. When you hear about the B group or the B complex vitamins, those are the water soluble vitamins. And then a last one that's not considered a B group but is water soluble is vitamin C. The B complex vitamins, I'm embarrassed that this is so horribly minimal, but you'll be happy. If you look at the function, See, all of these right here are the B group, vitamin B6, B12, folic acid. You hear about a lot of those. All right. If you look at the function of each one, you see this word again and again. And I know that's blurry, but what is that word? These act as coenzymes for various metabolic processes. So in other words, some of your enzymes will not work if you don't have that vitamin. Okay, they act as coenzymes for various things. If you're curious, you can read all about it. Okay. All right, and then vitamin C is also called ascorbic acid, and we've already learned about this. That without it, we learned about this in AP1. You can't, when we did skeletal system, you can't produce enough collagen if you don't have vitamin C. And collagen is found in all kinds of connective tissues, isn't it? And that's what gives like bones your strength. Okay. All right, so my friends, I made that real simple for you. Now let's look at the minerals. Okay. Every mineral is essential because a mineral is just an ion. You can't make one ion from another, can you? You can't make phosphorus from calcium. No, that'd be a nuclear reaction, and that doesn't happen in you. Okay. All right, so you have to have minerals in the foods that you eat, and we can lump these in two categories. One you need in more abundance than the other. The one you need the more abundance of are the major minerals. You need to memorize the list that they are major minerals. It would be handy for you to know the chemical symbol for each of these. So what is calcium? Ca. What is phosphorus? It's plain OP. Potassium, K. Sulfur, S. Sodium, Na. Chlorine is Cl. And magnesium is Mg. And then I put just a very embarrassingly brief function for each of these, or interesting fact about each of these that you've already learned. Okay. In the next unit, we'll learn sodium's regulation and water balance. So, okay. All right. But if you want to know more, here it is. See how nice I'm being to you? Don't you ever talk bad about me being hard. Okay. Trace elements you need in less abundance than the major minerals. Some of these will surprise you that you need chromium and selenium and zinc. But again, I do want you to know that they are trace elements, and make sure you know the chemical symbol. It's just good to know these. Iron, you probably know, is Fe. Manganese is Mn. Copper is Cu. Iodine is I. We already learned that iodine's in your thyroid hormones. We've learned iron's in hemoglobin. Cobalt is C little o. C big O is carbon monoxide. C little o is cobalt. Zinc is En. Fluorine, this is one everybody misses in a chemistry class. They think it's Fl, but it's plain OF. And selenium is Se. Chromium is Cr. Okay? If you want to know more about them, there's the table. Okay? All right. Now, I want to finish up looking at, I know I gave a lot of effort, a lot of pictures in the rest of your notes. This kind of fluff, but it's interesting. If we look at the famous food pyramids, this is a fairly ancient one. This is what the FDA used prior to 2005, I think. And what this represented was, in the course of one day, how much of each of the food groups a person should eat, an average sized person should eat, adult, in order to maintain their weight. Okay, so to be nutritionally sound. And what's at the bottom of the pyramid is what you would need the most servings of, and what's at the top is what you need the least servings of. So that's pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? But in 2005, the FDA came out with a food pyramid that was very different than that one. It looked like this. This was really complicated. I don't know why they went to this one, because it's much easier to see the pictures of the food. But on this one, each color band represented a different food category. Like the orange is still the biggest, and it's the grains, but they've specified that the grains if you read the details on it, um, that they need to be more whole grains. Scientists have found that in your cells, if you break down whole grains, it takes more effort on the part of your cells to do that, which is better for you than if you break down a processed grain. Like, think of brown rice compared to white rice. It takes longer for your cells to break down the brown rice because you break down white rice and white bread so fast you can't utilize it quick enough. Therefore, it's stored as fat. Okay, so the longer it takes to break down something, the more chance it can go through cell respiration rather than being stored as fat. But anyway, so you should eat whole grains, and they're much better for your digestive tract because they provide more cellulose in your diet. But also, what they added to this pyramid compared to this one is that little person walking up the steps, and that represents the fact that in order to be healthy, you don't only eat correctly, you also get physical activity every day. All right. And then here are some other food pyramids. Like, here's one that a few years back the Mayo Clinic put out, and they put fruits and vegetables at the bottom. Again, it's got the activity in it. And then this is the famous Atkins. They put the meats, the proteins at the bottom. You know, very little, if any. I don't even. The whole grains are at the top on that one. And then the Asian diet. It's interesting. Several years ago, I taught a class where I made the students create a food journal. How many of you have ever had to do that? It's awful. It's awful to write. You have to write down everything you put in your mouth daily. And I had them do it for 2 weeks. And then each day they had to figure out, based on what they ate, how many servings of each of these categories it was, which is hard to do if you eat a casserole. How many servings of fat? How many servings of carbohydrate? But you had to figure it out as best you could. How many servings of each? And then after a week, divide the daily amount out, average it all out to figure out how daily, on the average, how many servings of each group. And then I had them draw a pyramid that reflected it. So what they had the most servings of went at the bottom, and then the least servings of went at the top. And obviously, probably what was at the bottom for most of them was the grains, and then fats were close by, and sugars. Yeah. But what was at the top for almost every person was the vegetables at the very top, except for one person in my class, and his pretty much paralleled this one. But this student, both of his parents were born in Korea, and they moved over here, and he had an Asian diet, and it was just like that. It was interesting. But anyway, today, this is what the FDA has. Instead of a food pyramid, we have a plate. And I guess they think we can't figure things out on our own, so they actually specify in words the actual foods in each group. But there's a really good website that the FDA has put out. It's called My Plate, or choosemyplate.gov. And if you go there, there's all kinds of videos. There's little interactive activities. But you can plug in your age, your activity level, your gender, and it'll calculate for you how much of each food group you need to eat, like to maintain your weight or to lose weight or to gain weight. It'll tell you all of that. It's really interesting. It's a very good website you might be interested in. This is the one that's in your book. Okay, and you don't have to know anything about these food pyramids or the Choose My Plate, but it is very interesting. And if you don't do it over Thanksgiving, we're about to approach Thanksgiving, don't do a food pyramid then, or over the holidays, but at your normal times, you might want to create your own food pyramid and see how nutritionally sound you are. Okay. All right. So that's it on this unit. So next time we'll have a test on chapters 17 and 18.